Well, Halifax, by Canadian standards, is a very historic city. Not only have the Mi'kmaq lived here for 13,000 years, but when the Europeans arrived, hundreds of years ago, by Canadian standards, the history is quite old. Um, and I think Halifax is a great city. It's always been a city that offers a lot, a city of great successes. It's also been a city of great tragedies. But I think it's a city that has a great number of advantages that we came by naturally. A beautiful deep harbor, one of the best in the world. A nice location. Sometimes it seems like we're hanging on to the edge of Canada, but we're well located versus other time zones in places like Europe. Great universities. We've always had a lot, but it's always been my view, and the reason I ran for mayor was I thought we could push it a bit more and make more. And the big difference now for Halifax over, let's say, even a decade ago, in my view, is the multicultural aspect of Halifax. More and more people are choosing Halifax,
As the daughter of immigrants, anything that allows me to celebrate the history of the country that welcomed my father and his family here when many other places wouldn't, is good for me. And so I treat every Canada Day as a very special day, mainly because I'll never forget the kindness that was given to my family, and how we've been able to accomplish so much because of native-born Canadians who welcomed us here and support and helped us thrive.
We have work to do. There is still misogyny in our community. The more of us as women who can step into a leadership role, who are not afraid to name the things that we need to address, I think that's part of it. I hope when my daughters move on in their lives and in their careers, that they will feel that gap is closing. I think movements like the Me Too movement have unwrapped concerns around sexualized violence that has been endemic in our community. And I think we also need to name that the women who are both come from the African Nova Scotian community or the Indigenous community, they have two barriers that they need to try to transcend, and that's really where the hard work is. So I still feel as though I have had to push as a woman as a leader, I also know that I come with a tremendous amount of privilege. I often think back to the missing and murdered Indigenous women, and I said to someone one day, I said, if those had been, instead of those being young Aboriginal women who had disappeared in the night, if they had been 15-year-old basketball players who mysteriously disappeared in the night, would anybody have waited so long or disregarded those individual losses the way that our society did? And we need to really look hard at ourselves to say, how did that happen? So certainly some of that was without a doubt racism against our First Nations, but some of that was the disregard that we particularly had for those young women, and we need to do better.
Feel very strongly pride in being Canadian. They appreciate the role that our armed forces have played as peacekeepers, also in conflicts like the First and Second War and the Korean War, fighting for a just cause. And of course, we think of the two Gulf Wars, and there are many other events where Canada has been involved in trying to help people wherever in Afghanistan, Syria, and so forth. Canadians have played very important roles, and I think Canadians are very proud of that. They're also very proud of our heritage as a peaceful country. And while we respect our American friends and their history, ours is different because we became democratic and developed responsible government without having the kind of violence of a revolution. We did this through primarily peaceful means. And that is an important part of the characteristic of Canada, I think, that people are so proud of. At the same time, they are grateful to our veterans who have helped to make us this way.
Everybody wants to be at peace. Every reasonable person wants to be at peace. I'm so proud that our government is recommitting Canada as a peacekeeping nation. We have now committed a tremendous number of new peacekeeping troops to the UN effort internationally, and more details will be emerging in the coming weeks about that. But I'm particularly proud of this recommitment because of the way it's going to include women in the effort. And what we know from observation and from data is that when women are involved in peacekeeping, they tend to have a peacemaking influence on males, on their male colleagues, but also on the male soldiers who are in the region where peace is trying to be achieved. I think this points to the importance of finding gender parity in our armed forces and of including women in important decisions that affect all of our lives. I love to be a cheerleader for Halifax. There is so much to see and do here. I don't even know where to begin. But I can tell you that the one thing that everybody who visits Halifax comments on when they're leaving, and that is the people. How kind people were to them, how welcoming they were, the way they were spoken to and treated. It's one of our great points of pride. Now, when you're dealing with lovely people like that who are hosting you when you're visiting, it makes it all the more fun and enjoyable to enjoy the harbor walkway, the boardwalk walkway on the harbor front, Citadel Hill, our phenomenal new Central Public Library, an absolutely thriving local restaurant scene, incredible local music. We've got one of the finest arts communities in Canada living here. And all of it happening on the scenic and majestic beauty of Canada's Atlantic shore. So I think there's something for everybody here.
The last number of years, I would say Halifax has been slow to grow, but in the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen a lot of growth and activity. We've seen over $1 billion in investment in downtown Halifax, in buildings, in condos, in convention centers. We see the ships, the frigates being built at the Irving shipyard, so lots of construction, lots of activity there. So if I look forward 10 years, I see Halifax's future is very, very bright. Halifax's population has increased significantly the last couple of years. That's a very strong signal for growth, and we expect with the businesses that I mentioned and the activities that are occurring, I think Halifax has a very bright future in front of it. Canada and and certainly Nova Scotia, do have an aging population. We need new immigration. I mean, Canada is only accepting 100,000 people a year. We need 300,000 people a year to really meet the needs to encourage Canada's gross domestic product to grow. And it's the same way in Nova Scotia. We have an aging population. There'll be, I think, another 100,000 people over the age of 65 in 10 or 15 years in Nova Scotia. We will have, and already have, one of the oldest populations of Canada. But I see that as an opportunity. It's an opportunity for those people, many of whom will continue working, and the real opportunity is for younger people. 30% of the university population in Nova Scotia come from other areas. They come from the rest of Canada, they come from around the world. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could convince those people to stay? And last year, Nova Scotia had the largest new immigrant, or the largest number of new immigrants since World War II.
I'm an educator as far as watching to make sure that our African Nova Scotian children have the best education that they have. So I try to do a lot of tutoring, after school tutoring, one-on-one work with children that are in need of work. I love my culture. I'm a board member at the Black Cultural Center, so I really am an advocate for sustaining and preserving Black culture and letting other people in the world know about all the things that African people have contributed to this wonderful country. So I'm a very strong advocate for our ancestry. As far as tourism goes, when people come here, they need to know to visit the Black Cultural Center to know that the African people have made a difference. The building of Citadel Hill, the story about Africville, how people were displaced, and how strong and resilient and beautiful the African culture is.
So, when I was working at the library a couple years ago before council, I was the community outreach worker focusing on teens. So before that, I was a programmer who did teen programming for kids and young adults. And one of the things that I tried to do, because the North End in the New York Square area is historically Black community for not just Black Nova Scotians, but Black immigrants and Canadians from all over the world. I grew up with kids from Uganda and Nigeria, and some from Europe, but mostly the African continents. So there also is an aspect of making sure that connection of the continent of Africa, but also the African heritage of Nova Scotia. So always trying to do programs that would sneak in the history. So you don't really want to always them to feel like they're in school. So we do trivias around what Black history do you know, Nova Scotian and world, and also just trying to empower them to want to learn more. Like we're in a library, the knowledge is there. You just have to look for it. So also doing things that would make them have to open books and read, and spark their curiosity, and hopefully that would make them have conversation with their friends to say, what, I learned about this amazing person who created this invention from Africa, and now we use it every day. So it's a hard thing because our schools are only in the last couple of years really focusing on making sure that when they talk about history, they include more than just European. So it's a hard thing when our system is not made to encourage more education around the other cultures of the world.
I went to school in Gibson Woods. At that time, it was a segregated school. So the students who were in the school were basically all my brothers or my cousins. And I went there from grade 1 to grade 3. Then went to a couple local schools for grade 3, back to the small community Gibson Woods for grade 4, and then to Aldershot in 5 and 6. And my high school was in Cornwallis. This evening here at this event, you hear talking about NECIT with North Kings Educational Center. That replaced the school of Cornwallis. And then from there, they talk about racism. Was there racism back in the day? I was faced with in some cases, I guess, because of the complexion of my skin. I was either not black enough compared to some, or I was too black with regards to the white or blacks, depending on who you talk to. But I was always comfortable in my skin. I knew where I came from. Growing up in a small Black community, I was well known in the community through my mother and father. My mother and father taught us strong values, and it was always, you treat people the way they want to be treated. So that's the way I basically looked at life. And if there's any problems with regards to any racial overtones or something, I just dealt with it head on, and just was a way of talking to people. As a result of my upbringing, I always felt a call of public service, so I became a police officer with the RCMP, which is our federal police force. So being a member of the RCMP gave me an opportunity to be exposed to many different people, culture, and places. It's all about educating and an opportunity to meet people just by talking and being honest and outright. If people have any questions, concern, I just basically was able to share my experiences of growing up and just talk about any issues was there race relations wise. I became involved with the RCMP and was doing some lecturing as well.
Why we go and identify as African Nova Scotian, let me back up and just give you a sense of that. Because often I used to get that question, well, why do you guys call yourselves African Nova Scotian? Well, I think it would have been in the late 80s, early 90s. I think it was late 80s more, mid to late 80s, where a group of community members had realized that we were becoming extinct. And when I say extinct, I mean in the terms of, as African Canadians, we were being lumped in with the recent immigrants that came in the 60s. In order for us to really identify and really point out that we've been here much longer, that's when that term sort of started being used as African Nova Scotian, to make sure that we were a little distinct from the overall African Canadian presence, who, again, as I said, most started in the 60s. Very proud community, a community that, like many African communities of the diaspora, who are linked with church, community members, but we are a community that really doesn't have a sense of identity in that we don't have a distinct language. Our distinct language would be Canadian and a version of that Canadian language. So they are very proud in who they are, what they've done, and some of the accomplishments that we've provided for this country, not just the province, but for the country. You can look at, most recently, all the things that are being recognized, and you can look at most African Nova Scotians. Like you look at Matthew da Costa and his history, and being an interpreter for one of the founding cultures, the French, in this province. I usually ask people, first, stop, step back, take a look at this. You're looking at a person of African descent being an interpreter for the Mi'kmaq and the French. How do you do that if you hadn't been here before, or you hadn't had some sort of awareness or connection to the founding cultures, which is the Mi'kmaq here? You've had to had some connection prior to that time that you're being recorded as being one of the first being here.
It's a story about the Mi'kmaq who lived a great life prior to the incursion of the Europeans, and they had a civilization that was very well rounded. It was EU society. It was everybody looked after everybody else in that society. They had probably one of the highest standards of living in the world, and they were a democracy. The chiefs were not kings or queens or anything of that nature. They had to earn their positions by working with the people and demonstrating to the people that they were worthy of leadership. And they had a great religion. They believed in the Almighty. Was no houses of worship, of course. They lived their religion on a daily basis. And in my opinion, if we could get halfway to what the Mi'kmaq had in a social society today, we would be wonderful.